Hello students, welcome to week two's video. Week two, we are focusing on chapters 2, 3, and 4, as well as the cultural formulation interview. And so many of you should be familiar with the cultural formulation interview from our intro course. We talked about it a little bit there as a way to help understand our clients, their worldviews, their experiences, all of that kind of stuff, and the way they conceptualize whatever it is that's bringing them into counseling. And so definitely take a look at the supplemental materials on the cultural formulation interview this week, especially because you have a discussion post where you're going to be focusing on that. But we're going to get a little bit into chapters 2, 3, and 4 in this video. And so chapter 2 focuses on liberation counseling. The topics in these chapters are going to kind of connect as well as into next week when we get into multicultural counseling. And so liberation psychology was initially coined by Ignacio Martin-Baró. The development was heavily influenced by liberation theology, which actually stemmed from social action in the Christian church and South American Catholic Christian tradition. Ultimately, he was murdered for his work in standing up against oppression. And since his death, his work has been further developed by other scholars and has been extended to address other forms of inequality in addition to the ones that he specifically was fighting. And so this gives you a little bit of the foundational concepts of liberation psychology. And so taking a look at some of the terms that we look at is intersectionality, which again, we should be familiar with this. It's just different identities that we hold all together. Privilege, for example, considering our own levels of privilege, which we're going to be getting into this semester as well, and oppression. And so thinking of examples of our own or our clients' oppressive experiences. Also, we kind of look at the ways that, or at least this chapter kind of looks at the ways in which we integrate this into our work. And so there's like the more traditional counseling approaches, and then this theory also values within that like client recollection as data. And so, you know, that may be their own subjective experience, but that's the important part of what we're focusing on. The cultural capital that some people attain or retain and others don't have access to. Restore marginalized power and voices, promote the recognition of within group. Liberatory therapist views are that the client is the expert, the leader, the guide, that recovery is developed from the bottom up, and that we understand clients from their social context. And so you can kind of see how this can be incongruence with or in alignment with some of the theories that we know of, but in some ways it can kind of rub up against those as well. And so something to consider. And so what's liberation counseling in the oppressed? We have to look at the recognition that racism and prejudice exist and that there are people that are oppressed. We need to make sure that we're aware of our own biases, assumptions, and judgments. We're culturally open. We promote wellness and fairness. We gain trust with clients through radical humility and empathy, and that we don't sit in positions of neutrality as a traditional counselor might do. Because ultimately our own self-disclosure is in acknowledging those social identities and social positions and how they influence our world and how we understand it, and our clients' world and how they understand it. And so we shouldn't be ignoring those things. We should actually be bringing them out into the open. We should also be regularly examining our own contributions to injustice and equality. And we strive to model service to humanity, activism, and self-care. So our assessments really look at strengths, cultural capital, creativity, and the history of the client. We want to nurture their spiritual development and activism. And when assessing their legal history, we want to look at the considerations of influence of privilege and oppression, some of which are listed here and in our text. And so these are some of the discussion questions that this chapter brings up. And so it'll be really helpful for you to take a look at them, consider them, and think about how they might impact your work as a counselor, as well as your clients' experiences in counseling. And so we're going to move on to, let's see, the next chapter. All right. So the next chapter we're going to look at is chapter 3. I'm going to share this with you here. All right. So how do we do this with humility, empathy, and responsiveness? And so first, the text looks at, or this chapter looks at, some working definitions for a culture of humility and empathy in counseling. And so considering the following questions: how do you continue to enhance humility and empathy in counseling? And we, again, have kind of gone over these things in multiple courses: self-reflection and self-examination. So continuing to monitor yourself, what's coming up for you in regards to clients, and how does that affect the work that you're doing with them? Some principles are lifelong exploration, right? We never hit culture of humility. We're constantly working towards it. We want to acknowledge power dynamics and biases, and advocacy to dismantle the systems, the systemic barriers that are present, and then ultimately counseling with empathy. The chapter gets into the utilization of culturally responsive interventions, so awareness and challenges of racial colorblind and cultural blind approaches, and the ways in which these approaches actually kind of hurt the relationships between client and counselor, and are not healthy in creating, sustaining, or living in systems in which we all celebrate our differences and our own perspectives and ideas and experiences and all of that stuff. It just kind of erases our identities and experiences. And so thinking about the following questions: when you think about the problem you're presenting today, can you think about how people in your family have managed or resolved it before, right? And so that gets into that cultural formulation interview of, like, how does the client, their culture, their family, their, different identity groups see or view the issue? Are there family traditions or rituals that have worked to manage the problems that you're dealing with today? And these are all ways to understand our clients a little bit more, so that we can get to those deeper levels of exploring meaning and helping them get to some form of resolution. Ask them about the different group identifications and values of those groups, and what primary beliefs and assumptions are relevant in their cultural identities regarding the issue that they brought into counseling. And so some questions that are present in this chapter are listed here and also in the text for you to consider and think about as you're going through this topic. So we're going to shut down 3, and we're going to get into our last chapter for this week, which is chapter 4 on social justice and advocacy readiness. So let me get this up. All right, here we go. So chapter 4. So what is social justice? It incorporates social issues that involve the family, the individual community, the wider society, and even the international community. A common definition is the full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs, and not just to meet the needs of certain majorities or certain individuals or groups of individuals. Social justice requires the equitable distribution of advantages, opportunities, and resources, as well as physical and psychological safety for all members of the society. And so it is called, social justice is called the fifth force in counseling and psychology. So they have like, the psychoanalytic, the cognitive behavioral, and so on. So the fifth force is known as the social justice force. It challenges mental health professionals to look beyond the individual and notice the larger influential factors in the client's life, right? Like we don't live in a vacuum, we live in the society that we're situated in, and how does that ultimately impact our clients? This chapter takes you a little bit through an historical journey of social justice and the ways in which it has impacted individuals. And so the question of this asks, what social injustices are you aware of just within your own life, people that you know in your own communities, and then kind of get broader from there, right? And perhaps you can think of ones that aren't really addressed directly in the text. So why is this so important? Taking a look at CACREP, who is the accreditation body for counseling education, it says that counselors in training need to develop the advocacy processes to address institutional and social barriers that impede access, equity, and success for clients, right? So it's important. Our clients are number one. We're supposed to be making sure that they're taken care of. That we're committed to the principles of social justice. We develop skills and creativity and courage to ameliorate the consequences, right? We can't maybe, change the whole system by ourselves, but we can help the client to work towards, or we can kind of work towards helping to decrease the impact, the negative impact that it's having in our clients. We're also situated in an optimal position to help society's inhabitants to understand the effects of social injustice on the well-being of larger societies. So the more that we work to help our clients and help them to understand this, the more that they can go on and kind of, work to change things, and it sort of becomes a bit of a ripple effect. And so articles dating even back to the late 20th century address the concepts of social justice and what counselors and counseling students should be paying attention to. In addition, it takes a look at the ACA Code of Ethics and social justice and what it means to be a counselor and our role in this movement. We are also called to be advocates for our clients, advocates for the profession, advocates for well-being. And so it's important for us to know and be aware of these issues systemically and ways to work on changing them. So the liberation model, liberation psychology that we talked about plays a huge role in this, right? Recognizing that this is not healthy or constructive, right, for our society. And so it looks at the philosophy of constructivism, which is when we take all of our knowledge, right, each of our individual knowledge, and we pull it together for the collective whole. And so this helps to build a critical consciousness where we can then work to change things that maybe we didn't personally recognize for ourselves, but we recognize by connecting with others. Liberation, like freedom, has two aims: liberation from and liberation to, where the former strives to eliminate oppression and abuse at the personal, relational, and collective levels, and the latter seeks to pursue wellness for self and others, right? And so it's not just getting rid of the things that are unhealthy, but seeking things that are healthy and good for us. And so again, this is an opportunity to pause, think about this quote, what it means for you as a professional and in this field in your work with clients. So there's a case scenario in chapter 4, and it asks you to think a little bit about these questions related to it. And actually it says in the manual, so let me just check and see if this is in your book. Okay, so I don't think that this case scenario is in the text. And so I brought it up here from the instructor's manual. And so you can pause the recording at this point so that I don't have to read it to you. It starts off here on this first page and continues over here on the second page, and then has the same questions listed that are in the PowerPoint. And so take a look at this, consider the questions, and then when you're ready, go ahead and press play, and we'll continue. You can continue the rest of this recording. All right, so hopefully you all are back now from looking at that case scenario. All right, so it gets a little bit more into intersectionality and ways in which we need to make sure that we're being mindful of specific identities and how when an individual holds one or more of them, it impacts them in a little bit of a different way. And so you can definitely look up the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. We get to talking about her in a later discussion post in this course, but she kind of coined that term, pulled from the legal venue, and we kind of have brought it into the counseling world. One quote that I read from a research article that addressed intersectionality was that, once you blend the ingredients to make a cake, you then can't pull them back out. And of course, I'm kind of ruining that quote, but basically, like, once the ingredients are blended, you can no longer have them individually, right? And so that's kind of like us and our identities. All of them blended together make up who we are, and we can't just pull one out and say, well, I have this identity and that means this, or I have this identity and that means this. But like, I am a collective of all of these identities, and that's kind of what intersectionality touches on. And so some thoughts here, some questions, again, that I believe are listed in your text to think about. If you'd like to pause the recording here, you can consider these and spend some time on them before moving on. All right, so the liberation model clinical case scenario. So this one is in your textbook in chapter 4. I'm going to open it up just to get to the page towards the end of chapter 4. So page 43, and then it continues on 44, so like right at the very end. And there are some discussion questions attached to this. So take a look at their situation and think about the questions. And again, how does this impact to you in your work with your clients? And so here are some additional questions you can consider as you think about the case study that you just read. So counselors are also researchers. Even if you're not actively doing studies or writing, we're investigating lots of stuff. We're investigating the worlds our clients are in. We're investigating our clients' own experiences in those worlds. And we're also trying to identify what best to do to work with our clients, right? And so we're constantly looking at all of these things. And so the question asks here, what are your interests outside of counseling that could assist you in combating social injustices or advocacy for change? And so, what are some ways you can kind of, again, to use the saying, like, think outside of the box to work with clients and not stay stuck in this is how counseling needs to be done in this way from this framework and so on. But, how do I best reach my client and connect to them in the best way possible? Social justice in a pandemic, it kind of highlights the ways or really it talks about the ways in which the pandemic kind of highlighted some more of the issues. It really drew a lot of attention to some of the things that many were not aware of because it didn't impact their own specific world. And so unfortunately, when you look at the events of 2020, specifically with the pandemic happening and then the civil unrest and police murdering of individuals, all of these things just, were kind of boiling up and just hit this point where people were able to see it that hadn't seen it before. And so again, your text kind of touches on this. And the ways in which this impacts us moving forward. It also talks about social media and the impacts that can have on it as well. Again, you can take a look at this in more detail in the chapter. differences and limitations of social media advocacy. They talk about activism versus selectivism, factors that influence how we advocate, and some things to consider, like, does advocacy have a color? Are people of color attracted to activism? How do we become an advocate? There's 3 types of advocacy that are identified in this chapter. One who pleads the case of another, one who defends or maintains a cause or a purpose, and one who supports or promotes the interest of a cause or cause of a group. There's important things to consider about yourself as an advocate, and there's different ways that we can advocate, and it's important to recognize that we're all going to be on different places, because one type of advocacy isn't going to be a fit for one person, or they're not going to be in a position where they can advocate in that way. And so we all need to recognize that there's lots of different ways to advocate, and we're all going to be different across the spectrum and our readiness to do it. And so learning about the issues is really important. What can you do to educate yourself and not put the onus of the education on the people that are being impacted by it? Looking for sites to do internships and work at that maybe are a little bit out of your comfort zone so that you can learn and grow. Ask your clients about what changes they would like to see in their life and their world, and maybe how you can kind of be a part of that. Attend meetings in your local area, city council meetings, school board meetings, things like that. And then assess the interests that you may have that are different than your own personal experience as well. And advocate. They say, like, advocacy for one is advocacy for all, right? Just because we may not hold a specific identity doesn't mean that we can't advocate for the needs of those communities. And so there's a readiness scale that your chapter talks about. There's also the competency self-assessment, and then the school counseling advocacy assessment that you can look at and see, like, where you are in that. We can also use the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies, which you all know very well. If you took the Intro to Mental Health course, those of you who are school counseling and rehab counseling, you may not be as familiar with it. Hopefully it's something that has been covered in other courses, but it'll be really good to be aware of this and how this impacts our work as counselors. How to integrate it into our life. Again, this was discussed at length in that course, but if you were not a part of that course, taking a look a little bit further into it will be really important. And then finally, some of the discussion questions for the chapter that you can look at and consider before moving on. And so that is it for this week. If you have any questions or anything at all, please let me know. Thanks.